I should have canceled the ride. Not because anything was obviously wrong. No shouting, no threats, no alarms in my head. Just a small, precise feeling that settled in my chest the moment the door closed behind them. I drive nights in Seattle, April 2023. Rain like a soft blur over the city, streetlights smeared into halos. By then, I'd learned that the most dangerous rides don't announce themselves. They feel ordinary. I keep a small spiral notebook in my glove box. Ride IDs, plate numbers, the details people forget. That night, I wrote more than usual. Because ordinary doesn't stay ordinary for long, not when a pattern breaks. And that night, 3 patterns broke in ways I still replay when I can't sleep. The first of the 3 rides I'll tell you about started at a bar on a cold Thursday. Bars are a tricky pickup zone. Loud, people who've blurred the edges of their evening, group departures that smell of beer and perfume and cigarettes. The app flagged a solo rider at the corner of 2nd and Pike. When I pull up, the door opens and a man slides in as if sleep had been an appointment he arrived late to. He smelled faintly of disinfectant and a floral cologne. His jacket was heavy with the dampness of the night. He kept his head bowed, eyes closed, hands in his lap. For the first 10 minutes, everything was ordinary. He mumbled the address, an apartment a few blocks over, and I gave the usual quiet confirmations. Okay, left on Pine, right on 8th. I asked him if he was comfortable with the AC. He grunted. I traded my usual small talk for the safe, neutral stuff, the weather, traffic. Then his hand moved in a way that made the hairs rise up on my arms. He reached into the small of the seat, not toward his phone, but more beneath him, as if he were checking for something tucked into the seam. When he shifted, his fingers brushed leather. He didn't look at me. He didn't even seem to notice my mirror. He pulled up a small black object and set it on the seat between us. It was compact, colder than his hand should have been. For a second, I thought it might be a case, a wallet. Then he tapped it, and the metal flashed. A gun. Small. Serviceable. Not the kind of thing you see every night, not the sort of thing you expect in your car if you've been doing this for long enough to normalize strange behavior. His eyes slid up then, finally meeting mine in the rear view. He spoke without moving his mouth much, like he was trying to keep the volume down. I need some cash, he said. I can't get home without a ride. There are these moments where training and instinct, both vague and specific, try to synchronize. The course you take in defensive driving tells you to stay visible, to get to light, to keep your doors locked. Your gut tells you to get away, to accelerate and ignore whatever a passenger says. But acceleration might corner someone who's irrational. Making a scene could escalate. You're trying to calculate risk with no real numbers. I remember thinking with dull clarity about the woman who had left the bar 5 minutes before me, the bartender who was clearing ashtrays on the sidewalk, the neon that cast the parking lot a sickly magenta. I looked at my phone. 2:47 a.m. 2 minutes from a 24-hour gas station on a corner that had an attendant at night and a fluorescent pump that threw a wide, ugly light. I started slow. "Hey," I said, trying to keep it low and steady. "I don't carry cash. Put it away, please." He shifted, the gun moving with him like a second shadow. He said in the same tone, "I don't want trouble. I just need," and stopped. His jaw tightened. In the mirror, I watched him count breaths. I watched the rain bead on the window and run in tiny silver rivers. I tapped the gas station into the navigation and took a turn that kept us on a lit street. On the app, you can see the route. GPS blips at Become a Record, a faint insurance of witness. In my mind, I was already planning a sequence. Park visible, leave engine on, keep doors locked, have the app's incident report ready if he made a wrong move. The slow motion is the thing I always remember the most. The world outside the car shrank. The rain sounded like fingers on glass. The fluorescent light at the pumps washed everything in a color that made skin look too pale and hair too dark. I could smell the metal in the air, like a coin left out overnight. The color from the neon sign made the small gun look almost toy-like. That trick of light, how dangerous objects can look minimized by brightness. The man's breathing was a rhythm that I could count in the rear view. He tapped the object again, impatient, frustrated. The engine ticked quietly. I pulled into the well-lit pump and stopped. I kept the car in drive. He sat there, the gun on the seat, and for a fraught minute, nothing happened. People at the adjacent pumps looked at me, at the car, then back to their cigarettes. A woman in a coat came out of the bar and paused under the awning. I caught the angle of her stare and the way she smoothed her hair as if making an excuse to cross the parking lot. Maybe she had recognized the man. Maybe she had just noticed the tension. She came slow, then tapped my window with the heel of her hand. The tap was a small miracle. He looked up, startled in a way that made a quiet noise, not quite a gasp. The gun slid into his lap. He slid out of the car before dawn, hands visible, and in the light left the small thing on the passenger seat as if it were a forgotten house key. I remember the way the rain made an audible sigh against the roof. I remember thinking that I should have left much earlier than I did. It felt like a sentence I had to grate myself on. I called dispatch. Carla answered. "Stay where you are," she said. Not with imperative, but with that calm that cuts through adrenaline. "Are you safe?" I told her yes, but aware that safety is not a yes or no. I logged an incident through the app. The trip ID, the time, photos of the object where I could. The police showed up in a flurry that felt too quick for such a small-town moment. Officers took statements, took the gun bag as evidence. The app saved the GPS, the route, the timestamp. Later, the detective would ask me about the woman who tapped the window, and I would describe her coat, and a student at the nearby school would later be interviewed about what she'd seen. The ride left a bruise that evening. It left me with a new item in the glove box next to the notebook, a printed screen from the app showing the trip ID and the time, a small paper anchor in the sea of nights. The app listed the rider's name as Alex, but when police spoke to him, he said his name was Michael. That discrepancy threaded through reports like a small, persistent truth. The app said Alex, he told me Michael. Names are data points that can be wrong, or deliberately wrong. You note them, not for gossip, but for the record. That should have been the end of the kind of night I was used to. It wasn't. It was instead the first in a sequence that began to make me notice things I hadn't before. How quickly a car can feel like a single room with soft walls that you can close and keep the world out, and how fast those walls can become a trap if you don't think twice about who you let in. A few nights later, the second ride began with neon and sweat, and the kind of laughter that belongs to people who have already decided to be reckless. A concert had just let out, wristbands still on a dozen hands, the street full of people moving in pulsing motion towards Ubers and cabs. I was flagged to a curb where a group of 3 climbed in like a single wave. They smelled like aftershow, hot plastic cups, the lemon-sour tang of spilled soda, hair lacquer. They joked over each other on the back seat, a tide of names and half-remembered lyrics. One of them, a tall guy with a voice thicker from shouting, kept pulling at a black cloth that he had draped over his lap. His friend Olivia was quieter, with a soft intensity in her jawline that looked like it might snap if pressed. The third rider propped a duffel between his knees like a child holding a comforter. For the first 10 blocks, it was all noise and good-natured ribbing. I was supposed to drop them off at a place near the waterfront. The route in the app was straightforward. Then he reached into the duffel. It was subtle at first. The movement happened beneath the fold of the bag, but the way his shoulder tensed told me he was pulling something out. In a crowded back seat, strange things happen. A smoke ring, a phone flashlight, a prank. But this shape that came free had angles. It was a face covering, a mask so realistic it could have been the product of a prop shop. Pores, eyelash stubble, the mimicry of a human expression in painted vinyl. When he put it on, he changed.
Voices become instruments of control when filtered through something that hides identity. The tall guy's voice thickened in a way I'd heard before in people who believe hiding grants them permission to say the things they wouldn't otherwise. He started to speak through the mask, and his voice, not quite his, became something else, detached, with a cadence that wrong-footed the rest of the group. Olivia laughed at first, an uneasy, quick exhale. The man behind the mask began to goad, making comments that sounded more like performance than conversation, shifting into a mocking register. He reached toward the duffel again. I saw a hand dip into it and pull out something I couldn't quite identify in the dim. Maybe a bottle, maybe a heavier gadget. Whatever it was, the motion made Olivia's laugh die. She slid forward on the seat, and in the same motion, asked to get out. I remember that moment as another slow motion. The hum of tires over wet pavement receded, and the world narrowed to the rectangle of the rearview mirror. The mask, for a second, looked startlingly human. Eyebrows drawn, a slight half-smile that didn't match the rising tension. The muffled bass from a distant speaker vibrated the floor. I thought of the duffel zipper, the sound of fabric rubbing against fabric. The app's route blipped. I called it into Carla as a hush more than a conversation, because that was the easiest way to sound normal and get help without drawing attention. Carla's voice was as steady as it had been in the gas station light. She told me to stay visible, to keep the door locked, to try to move to a crowded area if I could. She pinged security in the network, logged the incident in a way that would leave a timestamp and a trail. "Don't let anyone out of your sight if they're behaving erratically," she said. That phrase stuck with me. It felt both obvious and insufficient. Olivia stood. She said, "I want out," in a voice that broke open from the rest of the group's laughter. The tall masked man tried to make a joke, a low barb tossed to test the waters, but she didn't laugh. She braced her hands on the roof and swung her legs out into the rain. There's a small decision every human makes in a tense place, to move or to stay, to speak or to be silent. Olivia decided to move. She stepped onto the curb beneath a street lamp and turned to look back at us. The people in the crowd who had been walking by noticed the small human drama of a person standing alone beneath light, and attention gathered like a magnet. Heads turned, someone asked if she needed a ride, a bystander called out, "You okay?" That handful of witnesses changed the dynamic in a way that was impossible to quantify. Inside the car, the man in the mask removed it as if it were a costume lifted at the end of a play. He shoved whatever had been in the duffel back in as the car rolled to a stop under a bank of sodium light. The mask's eyes, the fake pores and painted mouth, were the last image that stuck. It wasn't violence, not in the immediate sense, but it was a boundary test, an experiment with anonymity. When people hide, they often feel they can try things they wouldn't otherwise. Olivia's insistence on stepping into light forced them into a place where action had to be watched. She called the night simple courage. I called it social backup. Olivia's name was real. The app's record matched what we later wrote down. We filed an incident report, recorded the trip ID, and sent a short note and a screenshot to the safety team. The company's safety flow meant that GPS and timestamps were preserved, and a human reviewer would look at the report. Officers were not called in that case. There were no explicit threats, no visible weapon, but the ride made a mark. It shifted my threshold for what felt tolerable. The mask was a physical reminder that people can change shape inside a car, that a joke can become a test, and a test can become a threat. The fact that nothing worse happened was not proof of safety. It was, at best, luck, and at better, the presence of witnesses. After those 2 nights, I started noticing small things in my own behavior. My hands on the wheel at a different angle, the way I left the interior light off until I parked inside of others, the small ritual of unlocking the glove box only after I had checked the back seat. The notebook in the glove box began to hold more than logistics. It started collecting mood notes, too. I wrote down the way a passenger's voice can thin when they are hiding something, the way someone who claims to be tired will often keep their phone in their hand, as if that were a tether to civility. The third ride that shifted everything for me involved Maya. I remember the name because it was given to me with a small laugh, as if apologizing for being tentative. She was tiny in frame,
always folded into herself like she was trying to make room for fewer people. She requested a pickup that, on the app, looked like the sort of shorthand that students use when they don't want a door-to-door address attached to a profile, just near the alley by the old mill. I have a policy about alley pickups. Avoid them if you can. There are reasons alleys exist. They are service routes, shadows where things go to avoid sight. But there are also reasons people want them. Closer to a back door, a shortcut to a gotta-be home. I messaged her, suggested a lit street corner with a coffee shop that stays open late. She wrote back quickly, "I'm small, I'd rather not be seen walking." Her messages were clipped, and I could see a kind of carefulness in the way she chose words. I told her I could pull to the corner and walk up to meet you if she preferred. She thanked me with 3 punctuation marks and said she'd wait in the small gap between a deli and a lit bus stop. The pickup should have been simple.
I eased the Prius into a loading zone and watched. She came into view with a small backpack and a hoodie pulled up, head down. Her phone flashed a single green light. She looked up once and gave me a half smile that tried to be steady but didn't quite make it. She climbed in the back like someone who was measuring whether she could fit into an invisible space. Her hands were small and rested in her lap. She smelled like laundry and peppermint gum. I asked the usual soft stuff. Destination? She said home. She sent a text to someone she called Derek as soon as the doors closed. The tone of the exchange felt normal. "On my way," he wrote. She sent the map pin. The app's ETA said 8 minutes. We turned onto a wider avenue. She began to relax a hair. The city moved in its nocturnal cadence, bartenders sweeping up, bicyclists moving like punctured comets, a delivery truck idling by a restaurant that never sleeps. I took an extra long route because she had asked for quiet streets. She told me, when I asked, that she liked to take slow ways home. A truck idling too long near the curb is the sort of urban punctuation I watch for. I saw headlights pooled against a brick wall, then 2 figures step out of the dark like a pair of punctuation marks. At first I thought they were late-night patrons, people in a hurry. Then they moved toward the car. They were too close. One stopped at the rear quarter panel, and the other paced the side, walking with a familiarity that made me tighten my grip. They knocked, not politely, but sharply, against the glass with knuckles that sounded like pebbles hitting a jar. I saw Maya's body tense in the rear view like a catch. Her fingers found her phone again and pressed it hard. She mouthed something I couldn't read. I hit the lock on the door without thinking, the click audible. The men continued to pound the windows. The one at the rear leaned in a hair too close to the glass and looked straight at me, through the windshield, into the world, as if checking whether I was alone. Their faces were in shadows. I couldn't make out features cleanly. They did not speak. They kept knocking. The sound was rhythmic and insistent. The streetlight made halos around them, but halos do not always mean visibility. Sometimes they just wash shadows in a soft light that conceals details. My chest tightened. Carlo's name was a reflex on my tongue. I pinged dispatch. "I've got 2 men pounding on the window, rear and side, near the alley by the old mill." Her reply buzzed almost immediately, measured and calm. "Keep doors locked. Call 911. Can you move to a lighted area?" The app's incident report button felt suddenly small and delicate, a tiny emergency valve in a machine designed for normal evenings. I kept the engine running. I opened the window a sliver and said, "Is there something you need?" My voice sounded too loud because I had to be heard through the rain and the pounding.
One of them shouted something that was unintelligible, a low thing that rose like steam. The other beat harder. Maya's shoulders drew up like she was trying to disappear. I could see her fingers white on her phone. Motion on the sidewalk indicated people were noticing. One man across the way paused, looked over, and then walked on. There's an odd calculus to public spaces. A person observes and decides whether to act, which is different from acknowledging. The pounding kept happening. The city soundscape, engine hum, distant siren, the clink of a bottle tossed into a bin, became a backdrop to a single, urgent sound. I hit the app's incident button and selected unwanted contact because the panel of options never quite fits a live pulsing moment. The app asked if I wanted to share location. I did. It sent a small blue dot to the safety team, which meant my GPS coordinates were now in human hands. I picked up my phone and dialed 911 because Carla told me to, and because the men were still pounding. The operator asked where I was, my route, the description of the vehicle, and to keep a distance. Their instructions were procedural, calming, and the voice of someone who does this work every night. I described the men as best as I could without making the moment worse.
One of the men moved back a pace. He glanced at a window across the street. Maybe someone had looked. Maybe he didn't like the attention. Maybe he hadn't planned on people watching. They conferred, in hushed words I couldn't hear, and then one of them knocked one last time and slipped back into the shadow like a line taken in a draft. They faded down the alleyway. The pounding stopped, and for a moment the city let out a sound that felt like a held breath. Maya's knees shook when she laughed, the kind of laugh that comes after shock. She said, "I should have taken a cab," then corrected herself. "No, I shouldn't have asked for the alley." It was a small apology to herself more than anything. I said, "You did the right thing. I'm sorry." She rewrote the message to Derek and typed with hands that were not steady. I watched her put the phone down, fold into her hoodie, and peel layers of fear back into a composure that read as habit. By the time police arrived, minutes that felt like stretched elastic, they took statements, logged the app incident, and asked for video if any nearby cameras had caught the men. A detective with a soft voice spoke to Maya and to me, asked for details about the timing, names, and the ping from the app. He took down what I remembered, the route, the time. We waited until the officers left, and the night resumed its low hum. My notebook now contained a page where I'd drawn small arrows and underlined words. Pounding on windows, 2 men, app ping, Maya texting Derek. Sitting in the car afterward, the engine a small, steady hum, I felt a kind of tightness, not the adrenaline that makes you move fast, but an ache that settles into your chest and sits.
It's a residue. You don't just get back to normal, you change the normal. I remember the smell of peppermint gum and wet fabric, and the small way the light from the dashboard painted Maya's face in too bright blue. I remember reaching over and tapping the back of the seat to make a human contact that said, without words, "You're okay." In the days after, I kept turning the sequence over. The app log saved all the coordinates. GPS timestamps made a kind of skeleton for what had happened. Dispatch flagged the incidents with incident IDs. The company's safety team sent a polite email thanking me for the report and promising review. The police said they would cross-reference CCTV footage from nearby businesses and see if the men appeared on camera. In one case, a camera on a deli had picked up a figure in a hood enough to give an outline. In another, a student who had been near the gas station that night at the pumps later volunteered a statement. That is the slow-moving law of consequence. Often, it requires other people's pieces to complete the picture. But those official steps didn't erase the way I began to do things differently. I bought a cheap keychain flashlight and kept it in my pocket. I started insisting, politely but firmly, on well-lit pickup points. I kept photo evidence when possible, plate numbers and the app's trip ID saved as a screenshot in the notebook and on my phone. I began to practice the small act that felt powerful and simple, telling someone where I was going. I sent my route to a friend when I felt the ride carried a hint of uncertainty. These are tiny armor pieces. They do not stop everything. They make the small acts of survival more probable. There were other rides that winter that I didn't intend to include at first. A college student who begged me to pull up under a diner light and never get out of the lane because she wanted the steps visible as she walked. A man who looked like he wanted help, but then sat silent and stolid through a whole trip. The transcripts of those nights are quieter, smaller in the way they press on you. Jenna, the college student who later told campus safety she'd been followed after a diner exit, filed her own incident report and met with an officer named Ramirez. A man named Tom called for a pickup at the pier because his phone had died. He seemed disoriented, and the scene ended with a welfare check after a passerby took a photo. Those rides added weight to what was becoming a stack of small, uneasy moments. There is an arc here, one I didn't want to see but could not unsee after a few of these nights. Small acts of anonymity or boldness, the presence of masks or weapons, the pressure of being alone in a car with someone else's story. These incidents, the gas station gun, the masked concert passenger, the alley pounding, altered how I saw the city at night. It taught me that you can do everything right and still feel exposed. It taught me the importance of witnesses, of light, of documentation. It taught me that the most ordinary car, a Prius with a Car 47 sticker, a rubber plant, a thermos of coffee, could be a stage for decisions you only realize are important in hindsight. I didn't stop driving. The work paid the rent and left me time to write, but I started carrying extra evidence. A printed screen of the app trip IDs on paper, a pen that wrote in the wet,
a flashlight that was bright enough to be assertive but not blinding. I began to think of the car as a perimeter. The doors are not just metal and hinges, but boundaries you negotiate. I thought about light as currency. I thought about witnesses as insurance. By the time the third ride ended that night under the alley's dim geometry, the notebook in my glove box had pages and pages of small notations, arrows and underlined phrases. There was a triangle of ink where my pen had stuck in the rain. I had a new list of things to do and things not to do. I had the app's incident numbers saved in my camera roll, and I had, for the first time, a real sense that these nights were changing me in ways that weren't just practical. They were carving out anxieties that showed up in the way I closed my hands around the wheel, in the way I looked at every shadow near a curb. That night, after Maya got out and the pounding stopped and the officers left, I sat for a long time, engine running, light spilling across the seat. I wrote the diagram into the notebook. Alley pickup, 2 men pounding, 11:58 p.m., app pinged, 911 called. I underlined watch for camera. I closed the book and let the rain be the white noise that smoothed the edges of the night. Somewhere in the back of my head, a new worry took root. What if the pattern kept growing? I still believed, stubbornly, in the possibility of small kindnesses. I still picked up people who needed rides home and who trusted me to get them there. But there's a particular quiet now in the car that wasn't there before, a new attentiveness that looks outward and records inward. The city is a lit stage and also a place with shadows, and I have learned to locate myself in the margin between them. When I pulled into the garage later that week, Sam was waiting by the door with his flashlight and a tired grin. "You okay?" he asked. His presence was practical and human. I handed him a copy of the app incident ID for the gas station run in the Duffel and Mask show. We talked about city lighting, about the placement of cameras, about how drivers sometimes feel like the canaries in coal mines because we're the ones out there night after night. Sam said something that made me laugh, a small, dark joke about how the city will keep being the city. Then he said, "But you did right. You kept it visible. That's the small victory. You didn't solve the world, but you made a small thing safer." And yet, even with that, a nagging unease took residence.
The incidents had a way of replaying when I turned off the radio and rolled down the windows. In the rear view, the pale strip of light that would cut across the glass like a tongue of ice became a symbol I returned to in the night. The line between seeing and not seeing, between being observed and being alone. I began to check the mirror more often, not just to back into a curb, but as a measure of who else was in the world. There were open questions after those rides. The police followed some leads. A camera captured a silhouette that matched a jacket seen at the bar. In another case, the report went to a detective, and the outcome was, in the official sense, pending. One man was briefly detained and later released on bail, something I was careful to mark in the notebook as status pending, because certainty in legal outcomes is rare and messy. The company's safety team thanked me and said they were reviewing the incidents for patterning and policy changes. These things happen in slow, bureaucratic rhythms, the kind that owe more to paperwork than to human drama. But for me, the change was immediate and tactile. I replaced my cheap flashlight with one that clipped to my keychain and had a strobe option. I began to text a friend the trip ID when I felt nervous. I asked people gently to meet me at lit corners. I kept the little printed sheet of trip IDs on the dash as a talisman. I started to sleep a little differently, my ear tuned for knocks that might have been normal in daylight but felt discordant at night. And still, nights pull you back, not just for the money, but for the rhythm of being alone with the city and the small private truths that come up when the world is quieter. Driving at night is like walking a line between solitude and company. You can meet the most ordinary people and watch how tiny choices create stakes that feel high. You can do everything you've been trained to do and still carry the residue of nights that made you shake. I thought for a while after those rides that the pattern might be a fluke. 3 incidents, clustered in the drain of late winter, could be random. But then other drivers started to tell stories, small and measured, about similar near misses. Carla started forwarding messages from drivers who were concerned. Sam organized a low-key meeting in the garage, and half the lot showed up, holding coffee and the kinds of faces that look like they'd rather be asleep. We traded notes, routes we avoid, corners that are too dark, a list of neighborhood cameras that seem to actually record. The company updated a safety prompt in the app,
a small tweak that reminded drivers to choose lit meeting spots and to use the app's incident report feature. There is a strange solidarity in these things, the practical sharing of tips and the quiet human acknowledgement that these nights leave marks. You don't brag about fear. You record it. You don't dramatize. You archive.
The notebook became for me less about controlling the night and more about honoring the fact that I'd survived something that could have been worse. It's a habit that transformed into a map. I was still driving when the city warmed toward spring. The nights felt lighter, less sharp, but the echoes remained. Sometimes I'd catch myself looking at writers' hands before they spoke, or noticing the way they ordered their sentences. I'd remember the way a mask can make a person test boundaries, the way a small gun can change the geometry of an otherwise ordinary drive, the way two men can turn a teeth-grinding pound into a whole new story. There's one moment I want to leave you with for now, a pale strip of light that slides across the rearview mirror when you turn down a dark street. It's an ordinary, small thing, just the way a lamp hits glass. But it became to me a symbol of where I locate safety and where I locate risk. It's the line you look for between being seen and being alone. It's the thing that taught me to choose light, to value witnesses, and to use the little bureaucratic tools available to me, the app reports, the GPS traces, the timestamps. I'll tell you more about what happened after the alley, and about the nights that came after, and about what the company and the city did in response. I'll tell you about the small rituals that kept me going, and about the one time I thought, very quietly, that I should have just left. But for now, I want to ask something. If this is your first time hearing one of these stories, what would you do in a rear-view moment when something felt off? If that question stuck with you, it stuck with me too. After the alley and the gas station and the mask, I started to notice how people answered it in small ways. A tightened jaw, a quick glance at the rear view, a hand hovering over a phone. The city didn't stop doing what it does. I just learned to read the motions differently. Officially, the paperwork moved at the rate paperwork moves. The app's safety team opened incident IDs for each report. They asked for screenshots, timestamps, and any photos I'd taken of the object left on the seat, or of the duffel and mask. The GPS trace that the app saved became a spine for the reports. The route, the stops, the seconds counted in tiny blue dots. Detective work is often the slow stitching of small things. A deli camera that happened to face the right angle, a witness who remembered a jacket color, a bar manager who could say who left under a hat. One man from the gas station run was briefly detained. He was later released on bail. The official paperwork I kept in the glove box said status pending in meat block letters. That felt like the most honest way to record it. Facts that needed time to harden into anything resembling conclusion. The company held a meeting with drivers at the garage a week after the most intense cluster of incidents. Sam put out extra chairs and the lot smelled like coffee and damp jackets. Carla sat at the front with a clipboard. They told us what they could. Changes to the safety flow in the app, a small fund to subsidize extra driver training in conflict de-escalation and incident reporting, and a plan to work with city officials about lighting and camera coverage in certain neighborhoods. It was comforting in an administrative way, the same comfort a bandage provides, and it mattered. They introduced a clearer prompt in the app encouraging riders and drivers to choose well-lit pickup points, and they made the emergency contact flow easier to reach from the main screen. Nothing promised an end to the risk. What we gained was a little more structure for when things went sideways. Drivers began to trade notes more openly. In that low-key meeting, we drew a mental map of corners to avoid, lights that actually worked, and the handful of businesses that had cameras aimed at the right height. People who had been driving longer than I had shared stories that made it feel less like my personal misfortune and more like an occupational hazard that needed communal handling. We started an informal list of backup witnesses, people who are likely to be around late, like the night manager at the 24-hour deli, or the kid who bussed tables at a coffee shop. Sam printed a sheet and tacked it to the garage bulletin board. It felt small, but it built a network. There were other responses outside the company, too. Campus Safety held a meeting after Jenna's report.
She'd asked to be dropped under a diner light and later told an officer named Ramirez that she felt followed after leaving the parking lot. Ramirez later told me he wanted universities to coordinate better with rideshares about safe drop zones. A council member asked about a city lighting audit in a public meeting that got a handful of press mentions. Little ripples, none of them complete solutions, but they were attempts to make the night incrementally less dangerous. Emotionally, the aftermath was noisier. You learn the practical steps quickly enough, the app incident, the GPS screenshot, the call to dispatch, but the way the nights sit in your chest takes longer. For me, it was a constant micro-rehearsal of how things could have gone differently, if the tapping at the gas station had been more urgent, if Olivia had stayed seated instead of getting out, if Maya had insisted on that alley because she didn't want to be seen. I started going to therapy. I am not telling you that like a badge. I am telling you it was part of my way of making a life that included those nights without letting them define the whole of it. The therapist helped me name the residue, the specific tightness when a window was knocked, the small rehearsals I ran at red lights where instead of checking my phone, I rehearsed what to say if somebody tried to open the back door. Small rituals accumulated as armor.
My flashlight moved from the glove box to my pocket. The printed trip IDs were no longer an afterthought, but a ritual to place on the dash in plain sight. I made a point of texting a friend the trip ID if something felt off. Sometimes it was nothing. Sometimes it was a small comfort to know someone had the route. I kept my interior light low until I could see the curb or a group of people. I learned to leave my engine running at certain stops so the car didn't become a tomb when I needed to move quickly. And I kept writing in the notebook, not as a talisman against fear, but as a ledger of what had happened so the details didn't blur, and so I could offer accurate descriptions if anyone asked. There were moments when the urge to stop altogether crept in. Money is a blunt necessity, and solitude is a rhythm that, once learned, is hard to give up. The thought would pop up on long drives. Maybe I should just leave tonight, take no more fares. Sometimes I acted on it. There were nights I logged off early and went home to my small apartment with the rubber plant waiting on a windowsill. Other nights I stayed out because the work paid the rent, and I liked the time alone with my playlist and the worn steering wheel. I should have left became both a criticism and a compass. A sentence that told me when I could have chosen another option, and also a reminder that leaving is a choice you are allowed to make. I also started to see the thin lines between empathy and prudence more clearly. People who get into your car have reasons to be there, sometimes small, sometimes sad, sometimes messy. A masked passenger might have been trying to scare his friends. A man with a gun might have been desperate and reckless rather than intending harm to me. Those distinctions mattered less than the fact that the situation felt unsafe. It was the feeling, the geometry of behavior in my car that dictated my actions. I learned to offer human decency, a calm voice, a clear route, while keeping physical and procedural boundaries intact. Saying, "I'm sorry, I can't do that," is not cruel when your safety is on the line. It is practical. There were follow-ups, too. The detective working on the gas station run called to ask for more detail about the timing and the woman who had tapped the window. She was later interviewed and credited with changing how events unfolded. The downtown deli's camera gave officers a silhouette that matched a jacket from the bar that night. For the concert ride, human reviewers from the app's safety team contacted Olivia to offer support and to let her know the report had been logged. For Maya, campus safety later worked with local businesses to ask if they could leave certain lights on later into the night. Progress was uneven, but it existed. What I want to leave you with are some practical lessons I learned that are small, applicable, and honest. They are not guarantees. They do not promise safety in every circumstance. They are adaptations that made me slightly less exposed. First, choose visibility whenever possible. Meet in places with working lights and witnesses. If someone asks to be picked up from an alley or a shadowed doorway, offer to pull to a well-lit corner and walk a short distance if they prefer not to be seen. Visibility isn't foolproof, but it's often a decisive deterrent. Second, document and share. Use your app's incident report the moment something feels wrong. Screenshot the trip ID. Text a trusted person the ETA or the trip ID if you feel uneasy. Those tiny digital breadcrumbs matter later. They turn a memory into evidence and give someone else a point of reference. Third, don't hesitate to involve others. Call dispatch. Call 911 when you feel threatened. Ask nearby people for help out loud. A passerby noticing a person standing alone under light can change the calculus of a situation.
Social witnesses are sometimes the most immediate safety net. I still drive nights. I still take the money and the time to write. Both are part of why I do this. But the nights are not the same. There is a carefulness now that threads through everything. A flashlight clipped to my keys, trip IDs printed and folded into my glove box, a friend who knows to check in if I text the word odd. There's therapy, and there's the occasional moment when I close my eyes and replay the slow motion decisions, not to torment myself, but to reinforce the things that worked. If you ride late, if you drive late, if you know someone who does, tell them what you learned from this. Share a lighted pickup point. Keep an eye out. These small acts add up. Before I go, one last image. The pale strip of light across the rearview mirror. It's a mundane thing, a lamp coasting across glass, but to me it became a margin marker. When it slides across the mirror, I check who else is in the world. I check if someone else is watching. It taught me that safety is often about the line between being seen and being alone, and that choosing which side of that line you stand on matters. If this resonated, share it with someone who travels late, and leave one sentence in the comments telling me what you'd do in a rearview moment when something felt off. I'll read them. Sometimes the best advice comes back in small human notes. And sometimes, in the quiet between fares, I still think, softly to myself, I should have left. But not always. Sometimes you do what you can, document it, and come back the next night a little wiser. The pale strip of light across the mirror, reminding you to choose being seen.